Welcome to another episode of the Pennsylvania Historical Markers series. Hey everybody, this is Jonathan Moore with the Hometown Historian channel. We are here at the John Augustus Sutter Pennsylvania Historic Marker, which is in Lititz. When I went there, I was not able to find the marker itself. I found his grave, as you'll see later in the video. And thanks to Laura Klotz from MarkerQuest, she wound up sending me a picture, and then I sent her pictures of the graves because she hadn't when she was there in February, I guess, of this year, it was brutally cold and windy and wasn't able to get to the actual grave marker. And I was able to send her those pictures, and thanks to Laura for this. So in this, the cemetery opposite is buried the California pioneer, founder of Sacramento, 1839. Gold was discovered on his lands 1848, and he was ruined by the gold rush. He made Lititz his home from 1871 until his death in 1880. So, yeah, it was one of those things that going there, I wasn't planning on. I had said about the Lititz trip, and I didn't really know anything about John Augustus Sutter. We've covered him in two videos. The first one sort of covering what's routinely known in history, and then the second one, which was what the real legacy was. Because I had said a couple years back when the Black Lives Matter movement was going after a lot of the Confederate statues, also some of the monuments to the country's founders in relation to slavery. Another guy they went after was John Augustus Sutter, especially out in Sacramento, California. There was a statue in front of a hospital, and they wound up taking that down. And I had talked to Cliff about, because I didn't know. I mean, obviously there was something going on, I would think. Now, I had also said in the one earlier video, that sometimes you really need to research these things, because there is a gentleman with the last name of Baldwin that they had thrown, a big thing was throwing red paint on these statues. They had thrown red paint on this guy's statue down in Philadelphia because, he was, the older generation, that early 1800s, late 1700s. The assumption is this is an old white man statue. He's therefore bad. Turned out the guy actually was a really decent guy. And Pennsylvania, above the Mason-Dixon line, new slavery, I should say, was illegal, because we've talked about in the past, Cliff has talked about it a lot as well with his research, slavery still existed. Like, if you had slaves when they made the laws that you could no longer get new slaves, they made it so you were still able to retain your slaves for a certain period of time, and you were even able to retain their children. It was awful. It was a real hypocrisy, but they had made that relation that, people were against slavery and stuff like that, but they, the old man statue, he's bad. Here it turned out, even though people were against slavery, they weren't for the education of African American children. This guy had actually bought and paid for schools for African American children in Philadelphia. So that's a great example of why you don't automatically look at one of these older statues and say bad. You need to research it. It's plain and simple, because this guy, the Baldwin guy, is a guy that should be celebrated and memorialized, whereas John Sutter is the exact opposite. You wind up finding out what he actually did, and you're like, wow, this guy was not a good guy. That being said, there are still things like California would not be what it is today. California, I think, eventually would have obviously been annexed and became part of the United States, but during that period of time, it wouldn't have happened as early if he hadn't forced Mexico's hand in a way. So there were things like him bringing settlers in, helping with the Donner Party. You can't deny his brilliance. The guy truly was very intelligent and knowing how to present himself and put himself in a position to have tremendous opportunities. The unfortunate thing is when he had those opportunities, instead of using those to better humanity, he tried to better himself, and ultimately he didn't want to work anyways, so he ultimately messed himself over anyways, because he just constantly put himself into debt because he refused to work. He felt he was entitled. He, was a habitual liar about so many things. And then you have his treatment of the Native Americans was absolutely grotesque. And then because of his treatment and them getting away with it, they then started to put laws in place that, in essence, predated Jim Crow law, where you basically were allowed to do whatever you wanted to those individuals that those laws affected. In this case, it was for the protection of the Native Americans, which is ironic because it was not for the protection of Native Americans. It was to abuse them, to enslave them, and it allowed you the right to lynch them. And those laws basically were in place because of John Sutter. He's a cautionary tale as well of what happens when, they always say karma is like, what, and it really did come back around because of the world that he created. People came in and just stole all his stuff, and it was, and part of the tale of him as well is the commonly known tale. It sort of makes it sound like, he was penniless. Poor guy had everything stolen. He had worked so hard for this, when in fact none of that was true. And he wasn't penniless. He still had his gold. He was able to afford to build this house that we'll talk about in a second that's still there in Lititz. He was able to afford to be able to send his grandchildren to these private schools, Moravian private schools, which was part of the reason why he decided to come to Lititz. And so he was by no means whatsoever destitute. He was also receiving a $250 pension. I don't know if that was per year or if that was per month. The more I think about it, I would think it was more likely per year, but it was a lot of money back then, in the 1870s. And, for him to be able to travel back and forth to Washington, D.C. like he did, he was doing all right. And so, and at the end of the day, too, like him trying to get restitution for all he lost, they had a bill in Congress for $50,000, which Congress is like, we're not really interested in passing it. And he died before it had a chance to pass again, or to have a chance to pass if they came back from recess. But there were a lot of bad feelings. A lot of people knew what he did, how he attained it. They knew that his deal was with Mexico. They know that he fought on the Mexican side when the uprising happened, and he sort of turned brother against brother for his own selfish purposes. He was upset at his son for naming Sacramento when he thought it should have been named after him. And he is what he is. There are things that are worth noting and saying this is impressive, but his overall legacy is one that's really born in blood. And deception. So unfortunately, this is who the guy is, and there's, unlike a lot of cases, you sort of have to take, I'm hoping this is correct, it isn't character assassination. There's enough firsthand accounts from a wide plethora of people, so it's not like from one group. It's not like just a Native American say, this guy was bad, he really was horrible, blah, 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 or somebody that he had jilted or screwed over for gold. It was people that didn't know him previously, came in and were just despondent at the treatment of these individuals. Not only were they enslaved, but then it was the treatment beyond that they were dehumanized, that they basically were treated worse than animals. You wouldn't even treat your livestock that bad. And that's how he viewed them, and that's his legacy. So went on a little bit further than I wanted to here, but you know, he's still nonetheless he's an intriguing historical figure that needs to be talked about. You know, to understand our history of what happened. You know, partially that we're where we are. He founded Sacramento. You know, a lot of these different things that he did, there were some good things, but there was mostly, unfortunately, they're just way overshadowed by the other things that he did. That he made a choice to do this to other human beings, regardless of how he viewed them. It's unforgivable. It's unredeemable in history. It just is what it is. So let's talk about his house next. So here we have the John Augustus Sutter House. This is on the National Registry of Historic Places. I believe it was placed there, I want to say 2011, but it may have been earlier. I may be thinking of something else. I've done so many videos as of late, but I believe it was 2011. He built this house in 1871. He had actually, the last home that he had over in the Sacramento region was in 1865, wound up burning down. So he moved to Washington, D.C. for a time for about 6 years because of everything that had happened. He wanted restitution. Ultimately, he decided to move to Lititz because of his proximity to Washington, D.C., but also because of the healing powers of the Lititz Springs, the purported healing powers of that. And that sort of was attracted to him in his old age. Also, because of the Moravian schools, not only was Linden Hall there, but there was also, I believe, a boys' school at that time. So it was also very attractive to him to be able to potentially send his grandchildren to those schools. He just liked to feel the community, and just, it was a nice place to be. And across the street is what was originally the Lititz Springs Hotel, which when that was built, I'm not sure, but in 1930, they changed the name to the General Sutter Inn. Now, with those movements that we talked about earlier in the video, they wound out changing the name. They actually had a statue there of General Sutter as well. They removed that and changed the name back to Lititz Springs Inn and Spa. So not quite the same as what it was before, but the general idea. And it was just one of those things. The owners really, at the end of the day, it was the right choice, but it was also they didn't have a choice because the fear was there was so much vandalism going on at the time, so it made sense for them to make that change. But that inn is actually right across the street, right near the square there in Lititz, which is just beautiful, beautiful area. So he was able to build his home in a prominent area. He had by no means was destitute, so he was in a good condition yet. So, and with that pension that he got from the government as well, like he was in good shape. But he lived there till 1800. He was actually down in Washington, D.C. They were in the midst of, there was a possible bill for paying him $50,000, but Congress went into recess and never voted on it, and he died, like, I think 2 days later at a hotel down in Washington, D.C. His body was brought back, and he was buried in the Moravian Cemetery. And a cool thing to talk about that I'll mention just quick, he had wanted 6-foot walls around his grave. Now, the Moravians, once again, their cemeteries, everybody's equal in death, and everything is at ground level and doesn't go beyond that. So they wanted to honor his wishes, but they also wanted to keep everything as close to the same as possible. And his grave is somewhat separate from the rest of the cemetery. They actually built about 5 to 5.5 feet of the wall under the ground, sort of like a vault more than anything. So there's a little bit of a wall above the ground that goes around this grave marker that they have there. It's one of those ornate flat stones for him and his wife, because she died, I think, the following January, a couple months later. But they do have a little marker there at the top that you'll see at the end of this video where I actually visited the gravesite live. So thank you as always.
So we are here in the Moravian Cemetery here in Lititz, Pennsylvania. We're at the grave of General John A. Sutter, Augustus Sutter. He's the Sutter of fame with the Sutter's Mill out in Sacramento region. He actually founded the town of Sacramento, but he had the property, the mill, that they found gold, which caused the huge gold rush. He and his wife is buried here as well. He lived actually his last 9 lives, his last 9 years of his life. He was not a cat, sorry, but here in Lititz. He actually passed away in Washington, D.C. because he was trying to get money back for basically his mill and his farm and everything, orchards and all that stuff being completely ruined because everything got stolen. The miners came in and they just took all his, livestock and everything and just ruined everything for him. And he was in Washington, D.C. at the time trying to get that money for what he had lost, and never happened, and he wound up, I guess, died of like a heart attack in Washington, D.C., and then was brought back here to Lititz. He died in 1880. His wife died in 1881. And this is the Moravian Cemetery. Like we always talk about, they have the tombstones. Everybody is equal in death, and the Moravians' belief, and they're all flat. And they'd be over there as well. But we'll read this thing as well, and we'll try to get over to the John Sutter house because it's here in Lititz, and the flag's sort of blowing. He's the one who founded the California capital, the city of Sacramento, in 1839, August 12th. The fort which he established is today a shrine containing historical relics of the gold rush period, and that was erected in 1939. It's just such a beautiful day, and we'll go in to talk more about John Sutter, who he was. He was a general, and just talk about he was a really intriguing guy. So thanks as always, and we'll see you later in the video.